2023. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda of the Committee of the Whole meeting of Wednesday, October 25th, 2023? Mover, please. Councillor Blissett, Councillor Stetsky, all in favor? Opposed? That's carried. The primary items on today's agenda include a presentation from City Spaces of the Housing Needs Report before a presentation by staff regarding housing, including the draft official community plan, policy, bylaws, and a recap of the Housing Accelerator Fund. I'll now turn the meeting over to Mike, Rob, and the rest of the engineering and the development services staff to lead us through the items today. The floor is yours, guys.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Price and Council. We'll start by having a presentation by our City Spaces team. On today, we'll have Jada and Kevin from City Spaces, who undertook the housing needs update, and also they're the team who, or the company, and Jada particularly was the lead on the original housing needs assessment we did in 2020 or thereabouts. So that's a kind of a continuation of that with a different process, so different metrics. So what I'll do is we can get them on screen, and I believe they're going to share their presentation from their end, and then they'll lead us through all the information contained in this housing needs report. So we're really excited about this, and we'll take it away to Jada.
Well, thank you, Mayor and Council. We're happy to present an update to the Housing Needs Report, and we've taken a deeper dive on the data component, the evidence component. So my colleague Kevin is going to walk us through that part of the presentation. So Kevin, over to you.
Volume okay?
Thanks, Jada, and good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Kevin Crean, and I'm a Senior Planning Analyst with City Spaces Consulting. And I just want to make sure that the screen share is coming through okay before I continue. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, okay, great. So today we're talking about a housing needs update, specifically looking at an estimate of how many units might be needed. And this is using a new methodology that's been designed from UBC, and it was funded by the CMHC Housing Fund, and it's increasingly being used as a standard at the federal level. I've been in many meetings lately where they're talking about using this approach to estimating housing need when seeking funding, including the Housing Accelerator Fund. So it's becoming a bit of a standard. So with this update, we've looked to produce a unit need estimate looking at the next 10 years, starting in 2021 from the last census, because that's a good time frame to go by, so you can double check when the next census data comes out. And we're looking to produce that unit estimate by household size, bedroom count, and income quintile or group. There's 5 different income groups in this particular methodology. And from there, we can identify some key needs from those outcomes, and then have a brief discussion about some approaches to addressing those needs, looking at potential policy or regulatory tools to address them. And that will include identifying some populations with the greatest housing challenges. When thinking about producing an estimate of housing need, there's really 2 components. There's pre-existing unmet need that might exist right now, households that aren't having their needs met by their current housing, and also future demand, and that's a projection of future need looking into the future. And if you combine those together, you have a bit of a needs assessment and an estimated number of units that might be required. But from there, you want to filter those findings through an understanding of the local context in Cranbrook. And through that, you would produce a more specific target and strategies to achieve them in a housing action plan or a strategy. So today we're really focused on that estimating of need, and then the next step would be setting those strategies. So thinking of that approach from UBC that I was talking about, it's called the HEART approach. And the key innovation here isn't really a complicated calculation or model, but rather this income quintile concept that they've come up with, which separates households into 5 different income groups. Now, it gives you a bit more nuance in the estimates of need because it allows you to separated out by the ability to afford rather than just having a single unit target. You can actually break it out by price point. In this approach, the conceptualization of current unmet need is core housing need from the census. And the general approach here is taking households by the number of people and those income groups and trying to determine how many units might be needed along those factors. And as previously mentioned, federal programs are increasingly recommending the use of this approach and in some cases even requiring it. In this table here, you can see the outcomes for Cranbrook with those 5 income groups or quintiles. And it's all based on the area median income, which was $80,000 for households in 2020. And the different income quintiles are multiples of that area household income. So for the very low income group, they earn up to 20% of that area median income, or in this case, up to $15,000 or less. Whereas for the above average group, they're earning more than 120% of that area median income, or $95,000 in Cranbrook. You can also see the outcome for the amount that these households could spend on their housing, assuming you can spend no more than 30% of your before tax income on housing, which is a standard that's used in considering affordability. So you can see for the moderate income households, they can afford to spend between $1,000 and $1,625 a month on their housing. And that could either be rent and utilities or your mortgage and utilities. In the final column here, you see how many households fall into each of those groups in Cranbrook, as well as the percentage of households that are falling into those groups. And I would also add that this distribution that you see in the percentages here is quite typical. It seems to be fairly consistent in all the different places I've run this analysis, where you see about 40% of households in that above average quintile, and then 60% distributed through the other categories. And this general distribution also holds at the federal level. You see variation of maybe 1 or 2% within these categories, but it's fairly consistent. So turning to unmet needs specifically, in this case, we're thinking of core housing need. And just as a refresher of what core housing need is, so it's a concept that they use in the census that looks at 3 different housing standards: affordability, adequacy, and suitability. And if a household doesn't meet one of those standards, and they also couldn't afford to move into another dwelling without spending more than 30% of their income, they would be considered in core housing need. And those 3 standards for affordability, it just means you're not spending more than 30% of your before tax income on your housing. Adequacy refers to the condition of a dwelling and whether or not it requires major repair. And major repair means something like the roof is leaking, not that a tile in the kitchen is cracked. And suitability looks at the number of bedrooms compared to the number of people in the household, and it's a measure of crowding. So if we look at core housing need and those 3 housing standards in Cranbrook, you can see in 2021, about 8% of households were in core housing need, while 22% were below one of the standards, but they didn't quite meet the test for core housing need because they could move somewhere else in town and be able to afford it. A big thing to notice in these statistics is the difference between owners and renters. It's quite typical that renters have a higher level of challenge in accessing housing that meets their needs. And you can see in this case, about 1/5 of renter households are in core housing need, and almost half at 44% don't meet one of those 3 standards. If we take the core housing need numbers in Cranbrook in 2021 and then allocate them by those income quintiles and the number of people per household, this is how the outcome comes out. So you have 8% of households in core housing need overall, or about 685. And I would note that they're quite concentrated in one end of the income spectrum. So you'll notice that 89% of households in core housing need are in the low income quintile. And additionally, 71% are one-person households. And combined together, that means 63% of households in core housing need are low-income households with one person. So there's really a major concentration in that specific area and in these two income quintiles. Looking now to future demand or projected growth, we can allocate it by those same categories, and then it will allow us to add them together at the end with the core housing need. And the basic HART projection method simply looks back 10 years and then carries that forward. But you can use any kind of household projection approach within this methodology. And in this case, we've taken the new OCP estimated annual household growth rate of 0.85% and projected that forward based on those income groups. I would also add there's no way to perfectly predict the future, and projections should always be recalculated and verified whenever new data comes out, but this helps you understand a possible future and get out ahead of it before it comes to be. So taking that growth rate and applying it for 10 years from the 2021 census to 2031, you can see the outcomes in this summary table here. So the overall distribution into the income quintiles is the same as it was in 2021, but we've simply projected forward growth evenly across those categories. So you'll see 41% in that above average quintile, while there's 20% in the moderate. I'd also add that overall, this is 690 households projected to be added over 10 years. And in 2021, there were 685 households in core housing need. So it was really quite even when we put it together, which we'll see right now. So because they're allocated by those same categories, we can simply add together the unmet need and future demand. And this is an estimate of how many units you need. So this isn't how many individuals there's projected to be, it's at the household basis. And meeting this goal or this estimated number of units should keep up with growth and address that current unmet need as described by core housing need. And the numbers have been rounded a little bit to soften the accuracy. Overall, it's estimated 1,415 units are needed by 2031. And half of that need, 52%, is in the low income quintile, and half is for one-person households. So definitely still a concentration in those places. And overall, there's a greater need for one-person households in that low income quintile than any other entire quintile for all household sizes. And that's almost 40% of households. So you can see that here in this summary table that includes all the information we've looked at so far. So you have the quintiles across the top in the different colors, the percentage of the area median income it represents, the actual income, and then how much they can afford. While these numbers in the lighter shaded area is the unit estimate. So again, I just really want to emphasize the concentration in this low income quintile with 52% of estimated need, and also for one-person households with exactly half of the estimated need. And you'll see here there's 535 units estimated for one person in that low income quintile, and no other quintile has that number in their total. So there's really about a third or more of the estimated need for one person low income households. A few other trends that are worth noting is that the very low income quintile was all one-person households, and the need in that category looking forward is primarily due to core housing need rather than a projected growth in the number of households in that quintile. Most larger households of 3 or more people are in the higher income quintiles, and especially the above average quintile. And there are few households in the above average quintile that are expected to be one-person households. So typically higher incomes have two income earners in the household. There's one step further we can take this. The results we've seen so far have the household size, the number of people in the household by the income quintiles, but the number of people in a household doesn't always directly correlate to how many bedrooms they might need. For example, a couple might be a two-person household who only needs one bedroom, while a two-person household that's a single parent and their child would actually need two bedrooms. So there's variation in bedroom requirements based on household size, and we want to try and allocate the household size, the number of bedrooms they actually need. It should also be noted that most households would like to have an extra bedroom, but I would argue that's generally a housing want, which is different from people's basic needs. So here we can see the allocation of the number of people to how many bedrooms they might need in this top table. And then the bottom table is the outcome based on the needs estimate we looked at a few slides ago. And just to explain how this works, if we look at the two-person households, 76% of them are estimated to only need a one-bedroom. So those are probably couples who would fall into that category, while only 24% of two-person households actually needed two bedrooms. So those could be roommates or a parent with one child. Similarly, for three-person households, 70% only needed a two-bedroom to meet their basic needs. So that could be a couple with one child, or other combinations like that. So looking down at the actual outcome of that distribution, you'll note that most are in the one-bedroom category. So if we focus in on that, you'll note that 73% of the estimated need is for one bedrooms, while only 12% is for 3 or 4 or more bedrooms. Recognizing many people would like to have that extra bedroom, but if we're looking to make sure everyone's basic needs are met through their housing, there's very much a concentration in one bedrooms for the need. There are also some other aspects of unmet need that aren't captured by core housing need. And that's the primary basis for this analysis. So a few other considerations of unmet need that don't get captured by the census are individuals experiencing homelessness. And they're missed because the census technically doesn't count people. It counts dwellings and how many people live in them. So if you don't have a dwelling, the census typically won't count you. Suppressed household formation is also something you might see being talked about more and more in the context of the current housing crisis. And it's a concept that's trying to capture the idea that some households aren't able to form because of lack of housing or because of the cost of housing. And an example of that might include two roommates living together who would really rather have their own one bedroom, but it's too expensive. So they haven't formed their own households. Or another example could be adult children who are still living at home, not by choice, but because they can't afford to move out. So there's been a suppression in the number of households that there would otherwise be if housing was more affordable. Post-secondary students are also often missed in the census for similar reasons as individuals experiencing homelessness, but a little different. When you're a post-secondary student, the census usually captures you at your parents' house because you're still considered a dependent. So if you moved out of town from where you grew up, you might still be counted in your hometown and missed where you are living today, which can make it a little tricky to accommodate the needs of students because we're not counting them where they actually are. And the same thing carries for temporary residents or workers who just might not be counted by the census because they're temporarily present or they weren't there at the time of the survey. A few key findings, and we'll also explore a couple policy options connected to them. looking at this analysis. So I think some of the key challenges here are for renter households. Seniors definitely showed up in the core housing need data more than other populations, especially for renters, but also for owners who are seniors. There's an increasing rate of core housing need the older people are. Female one-parent households also showed up across the board higher for core housing need, but again, especially for renters, there's a much higher level of challenge than for owners. Low-income households overall have greater challenges with housing, and single-person households similarly. To address the needs of those populations, some key gaps include market rental housing, non-market rental housing, and accessible multi-unit rental or ownership housing. So just thinking of smaller one-level dwellings. To help realize more market rental, you typically need to incentivize it and give it some kind of advantage over a strata condo project. A few potential policy tools might include density bonusing, so either giving more floor area or additional height for rental over a condo project. Parking reductions can provide a lot of savings to projects, especially if it has to go underground. There's been some interesting uses of revitalization tax exemptions recently. Kelowna has a very interesting policy that they're using to incentivize market rental. You can provide fee waivers for development cost charges, community amenity contributions, or application fees. You could relax other regulations such as setbacks or other requirements, or you could also create new development options through new zoning changes, such as for multiplexes or another form where rental would be viable that isn't currently permitted. Looking to non-market rental, many of the same things that support market rental will also support non-market rental, but you typically have to go further because reduced rent revenue means you can't carry as much of a mortgage to fund the construction of the project. So some additional tools for non-market rental specifically could include the provision of land, whether that's by donation or long-term lease, or through co-location with municipal facilities, which we're seeing more and more, whether that's having a town hall on the ground floor with housing above, or maybe a fire hall. We've also seen libraries combined with housing. You could provide deeper relaxations to regulations or a greater density bonus for non-market rental. You could also have an affordable housing fund that provides direct grants, or you could delegate rezoning authority to staff, which would save time and money for these applications. A few potential next steps. There's many policy options that could be explored or regulatory changes to support housing affordability and increasing supply, but further work is required to determine the best options for Cranbrook. And typical next steps might include a targeted housing action plan or strategy. So I may just pause there for now and see if there are any questions.
Councillor Bassett?
Thank you. One of the things I was thinking about as you were doing the presentation were about in the demographics and looking at the age of our, the average age in our population, and the idea of a number of people that may be now in housing looking to downsize and move into apartments. Was that considered in the study that you did, looking at sort of the demographic breakdown for Cranbrook?
Yes, in the numbers we were looking at in this presentation just now, that it isn't broken out in that way. But there is an accompanying memo that does include some additional breakdowns. So in the custom data set that we use to do this work, you can separate it by seniors or single parents. Some of those things were touched on a little bit in the presentation, but we can actually pull out those numbers directly and look at their needs by those populations.
further to that?
Yeah.
Because I would think, I mean, my recollection is that Cranbrook does have a fairly mature population. And so I would think, and just from personal experience, because I'm at that end too, a number of people that I know are now becoming, moving in, becoming a single family household as a partner dies or leaves or whatever. And then they're looking to move into actually more upper end single family homes where they don't have to do maintenance, that kind of thing. It's that older women group actually is what I'm talking about.
Councillor Popoff.
Yes, thank you. And welcome back, Mayor. Kevin, you were talking that you're using the census as your raw data. Were you using any other local means of getting further, honing any further information, like maybe consultation with the Chamber of Commerce or the business community on the workforce needs are?
For this particular exercise, it was specifically a data study. However, moving to the next step and doing an action plan or strategy should absolutely include consultation with the public and with stakeholders in the community. And in the previous full housing needs report would have included some of that work as well. But this was a smaller update that focused more on census data. And I think one really important component to consider that can't be captured by the census is individuals who may be experiencing homelessness, who absolutely have housing need, but you just can't quite capture it through this data.
Councillor Popoff, supplemental. Or
Sure.
Rob?
Just,
Yeah.
Mayor and Council, I can add a little bit to that. So at the same time as City Spaces was working on this project, at the staff level, we did a bit of our own sleuthing by contacting a lot of the housing providers in Cranbrook just to kind of get an idea of what their wait list was. Just a very anecdotal kind of snapshot of where these organizations are at who provide typically affordable housing. And we have some numbers around that. It's quite high. It's probably around that. It was less than 1,400, but it was kind of, if I remember correctly, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was around the kind of 1,000-person mark need for across the board from all levels of housing providers. So we did some of that kind of more on the ground anecdotal data sleuthing as well as part of this, just to get a handle on where we're at.
Great, thanks, Rob. A further question, Kevin. So if your report is based on census data, how did you come up with determining the 3 metrics for core?
Core housing need is an established concept in the census, so it's actually a variable that's already published. But what we were able to do through this custom data set is look at those core housing need numbers in greater nuance. So typically it's just a single number. There'd be 685 for the city of Cranbrook, but we were able to break it down further into the actual incomes of those households and then the household size.
So if I'm filling out the census, I'm subjectively giving my opinion about those 3 core values?
The adequacy standard, there's a specific question for. Does your dwelling require major repairs? But for the other 2, they're actually interpreting your other answers to determine whether or not you meet those standards. So they would pull your tax return data and then look at your answer for what your housing cost is, or they would look at how many people you said live in your household versus how many bedrooms your household has, and they would calculate it.
Thank you. I asked those questions because, of course, there's a voluntary bias in asking directly some of those questions for people to maybe fudge their responses versus actual data. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I'm trying to determine whether we actually have a total count in terms of the need, or whether the report is based on a projected growth of 0.85% per year. For example, last week we got sort of a snapshot of the homeless situation in Cranbrook, 116 people currently homeless. We know of businesses that have lost potential employees. They went out, they held a hiring process, came up with a great candidate, brought the candidate to Cranbrook, and that candidate couldn't find a place to live and didn't take the job. So are those kinds of things factored into the numbers, or do we need to be adding them somehow?
I would say a little bit of each, or it sounds like you maybe have recently done a point in time count and got the results for people experiencing homelessness. That would be something you'd want to add on top of this analysis. I think the idea of someone who took a job and was hoping to move there and wasn't able to can't quite be captured in this data because they weren't counted in Cranbrook already in the census. But the hope here is with that projecting forward that you're accommodating those people who are arriving due to growth and employment changes, and that if you're adding units at that rate, it will address their need going forward. Of course, you'd want to monitor what the growth actually is, and it's quite easy to update this model now that it's been built to accommodate a higher growth rate if that's what turns out.
Thank you, Mayor. Couple quick questions. So I'm wondering if you could just give us your sense of the degree of confidence you have in the data from the census.
I would say that the census is a very strong, valuable data set. It can't capture every single phenomena that's happening, but it is definitely the strongest data we have to work with in Canada. I would mostly be concerned about some of those factors that I mentioned in the presentation. Student housing is a big one. It's worth reaching out to post-secondary institutions to get their enrollment numbers and try and work with them to address housing need. Definitely households experiencing homelessness. I think one additional piece that could be done is an exploration of estimating suppressed household formation, but that is a more complicated and subjective type of analysis than what you can typically do with the census.
Thank you. And if I may, you touched on exactly my sort of follow-up point was in addition to counting the point in time folks who are identified as being without homes at the moment, that, as you say, reaching out to College of the Rockies to get a sense from them, and I'm sure they have that sense, as Paul said, I think at the recent RDEK meeting, they've just built some new student residences and already have like quite a long wait list. So we'd be able to get a sense from the college, which would be added to the number from this report. So thank you very much.
So I think we talked a little earlier about kind of next steps, and you're probably going to address that in your going ahead slides. So in regards to the city of Cranbrook, in addition to the implementation plan, council's recently approved a mayor's task force on housing. And I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about kind of go forward from here, hopefully getting some of your expertise and help on moving forward with the implementation plan, and then what you can do to facilitate us in moving forward with that mayor's task force on housing as well. If you could speak to that, please.
Yes, I'm happy to. So I'll share my screen and outline a few different approaches to strategy development with a focus on task force approach to that. So one moment. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great. So when looking at developing a strategy, it's important that any sort of tool, policy recommendation, regulatory recommendation, everything is tied back to demonstrated need, that evidence that Kevin had presented to all of you, and including supported by engagement. But typically, to develop a strategy, there are, I'd say, 3 different ways that we're typically seeing and how you can go about it. And I'd say each one of them is not the optimal or the preferred way. It's really based on capacity, community, interest in being very involved or not so involved. So at the end of the day, all 3 of them can create a product, a strategy product at the end of the day. So the first one, I think, is what we would think of a standard is, you know, you can hire consultants, or you can do this in-house, and you would undertake some best practices research. So looking at those challenges and those needs, and looking at different tools that could be applied to address that, and look at best practices, comparable municipalities, and start to think about how that could be adjusted to the Cranbrook context. You'd have engagement with various stakeholders, and you prepare a strategy report. And sometimes that kind of process can be supported by an advisory group or a committee. So I'd say that first bullet there, that process, that's where you would typically see where, you know, you would have the consultants kind of go away and do the work, and then come back at key milestones and present, you know, work in progress and draft strategy to stakeholder, staff, and council at points in time. But really, it's the consultants going away or staff going away and doing the work, you know, kind of behind closed doors a little bit. Another approach to going about it is what we call a design thinking process. So it's a much more collaborative approach, and it's an iterative approach where we involve the community in more of those steps of the ways rather than at those key milestones. And so it is more of an evolution where, you know, we of course do the homework, best practices research, but we really work with different stakeholders in the community, sometimes council as well, on prototyping solutions, and then testing and evaluating those solutions based on, you know, different criteria that we think would be successful in Cranbrook, and then going through a prioritization exercise. And at the end of the day, you'd still have a strategy report to do that. And then another approach is effectively co-developing strategies in a highly collaborative process with a task force. And so that one, it's the opposite of consultants or staff going away and coming at key inputs. It's really supporting a group, a local group, who would lead that strategy, and as supporters and experts in the field, we would provide you know, subject matter expertise and facilitation along the way, but it's really led by the task force itself. So another way to look at it is in terms of the level of participation and collaboration on that first tier. You know, there's less participation, less collaboration, but when you get to a task force, that's where there's a lot more collaboration and a lot more participation. So I'll zoom in a little bit on a task force approach to strategy development. So from our experience of facilitating this in other communities, a task force is typically comprised of local industry experts and community champions, and that can look differently in every community, but it's really those that have been involved in development and planning, or securing funding, or, you know, it could be members of the development community, could be Chamber of Commerce, but it's also usually those who have had quite a bit of experience and can bring expertise to the process. And really, we're looking for folks that would be bringing original ideas and creative problem solving skills to the table, but grounding it really in that local context. In terms of process, this is with a task force is typically very collaborative, and with frequent workshop meetings. And what we found that have worked well in the past is having a frequency of a workshop meeting with a task force every 1 to 2 weeks. And so it's a high degree of participation. It requires full commitment to everyone who's involved. And it is an intensive process, and it is usually a more of a compressed process, but it's done so intentionally. So when we look at those other I guess conventional or traditional types of approaches where, you know, consultants go away and they come back, that process can have a lot of back and forth and quiet moments in time. Whereas when we look at something like a task force, we are leveraging momentum, and we're leveraging the interest and enthusiasm of a group that's coming together. And we really want to build off of every single meeting, every single workshop in fairly quick order, so we can evolve strategies together with a sense of urgency effectively. So what that might look like is you would have, you know, a workshop to just make sure everybody understands the terms of reference and their roles, the role of outside support, the role of staff, and really setting the framework and the container in which this process is going to unfold. And then it's a very structured set of meetings where there is some brainstorming, but also a narrowing down of what could work and testing ideas together. And so every time the group would meet, they would see the strategy, you know, it's the bones of the strategy being built one on top of the other. And by the end of the process, the thread is very clear of outcome, and there's buy-in the entire way. And the task force can make some strong recommendations based on that type of process. So we had facilitated a task force strategy approach for the district of Saanich starting in 2020. And this is the process timeline from that process. So we can see that altogether it was about a 6 to 7 month time frame. Started off with, you know, appointing the members of the task force, and then we went into from October till February. So that's about 5 months of meeting every second week. But there was a point in time where we were meeting on a weekly basis with the task force, and it was, you know, rolling up your sleeves and getting really deep into the strategies. And again, from this work, we did have support from the district staff on some of the I'd say areas of focus, and as consultants we would bring in, you know, examples of best practices and other examples to help inspire the group. But really we were there as facilitators to help the task force who were leading the identification of the solutions, and we were helping them along the whole way. So it was broken down into focus areas. There was even a component on what we called referral items for council. Maybe just touching a bit on that, as we were developing strategies with the task force on housing, it became apparent that other related challenges and potential solutions were surfacing, and we didn't want to dismiss them. So we were parking them as other referral items for council afterwards. And it did form actually a part of the report at the end of the day. In this particular process, the strategies were identified by the task force, and actually the district of Saanich staff wrote the strategy report based on the task force recommendations. But you know, we can do things a different way depending on capacity in house. Something like this the strategy itself can be developed externally by consultants if that is a desire. So. And that's all I had to share on the task force component of this presentation. And okay, there it is. Happy to answer any questions that you have. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jada. That's Great information. I'll go around the table here. Councillor Graham.
Yeah, thank you. I just have just a question and a thought on the task force. And how does the task force, like you put in the 7 months and you get your final report? That's great, but what if there's nobody there to build it? It's not like we have developers banging down our doors to build anything in Cranbrook. So what do we do with the report? And it's great, we've identified this. Who builds it when there's no one there to build it?
You know, that might even be one of the areas, the focus areas of the strategy in order for it to be successful, or even an implementation item. We have been working in other communities recently related to workforce housing, workforce development strategies. It's a very similar issue. For example, there's a high degree of job vacancy in the construction sector, and there's a labor shortage in even building and developing. And sometimes there's even a skills gap. So, you know, maybe we're trying to build a different kind of product in Cranbrook than maybe the local industry has experience in doing. That might actually form, or could form, a strategy in itself. Is how do we scale up the sector in Cranbrook? How do we scale up the development and building sector? And there's, you know, off the top of my head, not to make any recommendations on strategy right now, but in some other communities, what we've suggested, and we've had economic development and Chamber of Commerce support this, is how do we start attracting, you know, the established builders and developers maybe in other regions. You know, maybe there might be some who are developing in the central Okanagan, and if you can say, hey, what do you think about expanding your market this way, or lending your expertise to our local builders, and having that support, and also different training exercises that we've recommended as well, so that we can scale up the sector. But that is you know, at the end of the day, you're going to want to have a strategy that has motion and wheels. And if that is a potential barrier to implementation, or things won't even move off the ground, it should actually probably form a part of the focus area to begin with, and yeah, be part of the strategy.
Thank you. Rob Bake has a comment.
Yeah, just Jada, if you don't mind, I have a quick question, because I was thinking about the slide that you had with Saanich and the idea of a task force. And in the example that you had, they sort of indicated from Saanich that there was sort of an endpoint with the task force. And do you have any, like, my thought was you could have a task force that would then continue and be the actual implementer of a strategy. So if you have the right people at the table, particularly because, you know, I mean, our core housing need clearly is low income based. So that type of development occurs at a different level with different partners. Like, have you seen examples where the task forces have become kind of the implementers of the strategy? I'm just thinking, like, in the context of, say, even Cranbrook, we'd have a task force, but again, we have limited resources. You have a department of 3 people, you know. So have you seen that done, where the task force becomes a leader for implementing? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it depends on who's comprised the task force. But if you have industry representation on there, and if they're involved every step in the way, there's an increased likelihood that they will become, you know, invested and committed to seeing things through. And a good strategy will also have a strong implementation component, where not only do you say what it is that we need to do, but who is going to be involved and effectively lead the implementation. So having a roles and responsibility. Some of that might be led by, you know, City of Cranbrook. Some of it might be partnerships. Some of it might be industry led. But also with that is, you know, if there's going to be a certain organization or industry or sector leading the implementation, what kind of resources are required in order for that organization and group to be able to truly implement that specific strategy. So in my mind, I mean, again, it really depends on the process and the task force, and, you know, working with staff if that is a desired type of framework for a strategy, because not all strategies go to that level of detail. But I do think it is helpful to identify who could take the lead on implementing it. And indeed, if you have members of the task force that a specific strategy aligns with their area of influence and their strengths and their skills, then yeah, for sure, members of the task force could be identified as being the implementers. And if they're the ones recommending these strategies, then there's an accountability measure as well embedded in that, because they were part of that process and now they've been identified as key implementers.
Thank you for that, Councillor Papa.
Yes, thank you. Great question, Councillor Graham. Jada, as you were talking, and also the question Rob was asking of you, what was coming to mind for me was the Village of Whistler housing strategy, where they started with an housing strategy, then they rolled that into an implementation, and they've been doing that for decades now, where it's exactly as you're saying, the people that were part of the strategy are now the industry that's actually doing the building. So I don't know if you have a thought on that or not, but I think that's pretty much in line with what we might be thinking about here going forward. What's your thought about the Whistler Village, Jada, if you do have a thought?
Well, I wasn't involved in that process, but I do, connect with the groups here quite frequently. But you're right, is that one thing that you just touched on is it's updated frequently, and that's also something that we want to be a factor, is a timeline on implementation. Likely you're looking at a 3-year horizon in terms of implementation, and then you want to revisit the strategy. In terms of monitoring it, what has been implemented, do we still have the right players involved leading and implementing, and if anything needs to be adjusted. But looking at their approach to implementation, always going back and looking at the strategy and seeing its effectiveness and then fine-tuning it. But it's also a good moment, as Kevin mentioned before, is to also look at the data to see have these strategies as they've been implemented having an impact? Are we achieving our desired outcomes as we set it? And based on that information from data, and we can even say, these are the key indicators or benchmarks to let us know if we're hitting the mark or not. And if we're hitting the mark, then maybe we continue doing what we're doing, or if it's not making as much of an impact as we would like, then instead of continuing on that path, maybe it's time to reflect and to adjust them.
Thank you. Anything further, Councillor Papa? No. Councillor Ray, anything? No. Councillor Brissette?
Well, thank you. And I guess this is actually probably more directed to staff. So if we look at the numbers that came out of this report, and we look at what we have already approved in housing, maybe you haven't done that yet, or to me, I think that would be something we should look at, is where's the gap, where's the gap, and what we should focus on. If you could comment.
Sure, through the mayor. I mean, we've looked at it anecdotally. I mean, if you look at what we've approved over the past few years, they've largely been market rental housing projects. And so when I look at this updated assessment, it's quite clear that it's the non-market, low-income demographic, those kind of 3 categories, the very low, and moderate, which I think we're greatly lacking. If you think about the number of projects that have come to fruition, we had the Chief Agnes building, which was 37 units, and the BC Housing building that was recently opened, but that was only like a net new 8 units. There was already 8 units there in terms of 2 fourplexes, and they built 20. And so, we're looking at just a hair under 50 units that have been built in a couple of years. But majority of the projects we have, they've all been market rental. We just recently, the most recent one we approved, that the principle was the idea that it would be kind of more affordable rent, is the one on by Parkland on 11th. But that, again, in discussion with the developers, is partly going to be on whether or not they can receive the appropriate funding grants from places like CMHC to develop an affordable housing project. I think either way they'd like to do the project. A lot of it's going to depend on whether or not they can secure those types of fundings and grants and things to make it so it becomes an affordable rental project. And so, yeah, I think, again, without definite numbers, I mean, we're sitting at 2 projects that are expected to hopefully start at some point with the 2 West Urbans, which is 150-ish units, and those, again, market rental. But But the issue that we're seeing now in this, our global economy, and we all say this word, but there's so many factors, that Councillor Graham brought up that actually affect the development of anything, frankly. And I think, in discussion with some, industry experts recently and, talking about this on a daily basis, even just something as simple as the interest rates going up makes it significantly much more difficult for people to take on big projects of great scale for sure. But then we're seeing this giant shift. I'm calling it a paradigm shift in the way we're looking at housing. I mean, we've got the federal government, with their half grant and looking and talking about density, which we find kind of funny because planners have been advocating for that for, however long. So, and that's fine. But, the advent of, I think they're going to remove the GST on new builds. So, when all these factors are going to come to play. But I think the biggest need that I see is kind of those three categories, and that we haven't had very, very little development of that type of housing in Cranbrook that I can think of. Yeah.
So then we would want to be advocating with those like provincial government and stuff to get that low income housing.
Yeah, I think in consideration of what we've heard today and some of the information that Jada just gave us and the idea, that the principle that we're going to start a task force, I think, off the top of my head, just at the staff level, I'm thinking, well, if we're going to build, some sort of task force around housing to create a strategy, because I think that's the logical next step. We have numbers now. How do we get them, right? So it's development of a strategy. And if you go with a task force, I immediately, what comes to my mind is if that's the gap that we're trying to fill, those are the seats you want to fill on a task force. The affordable housing providers, the funders, the lenders, potential development interests, exploring those individuals who have done and take on these projects or who are specialists in these types of projects, because then, as Jada said, you bring those expertise to the table, they develop a strategy, then there's the buy-in. And then I would see, depending on what, council's wish, of course, is if you have this task force, I would think we wouldn't, I'm just speaking out of turn, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I wouldn't think we would want the task force to end once we have a strategy, because again, it comes to capacity at the city hall and it comes to all these things is, you'd have that task force set up. They can start implementing, they can start chasing the funding, they can apply for the grants, they can do, and the city's a partner, certainly a big partner in that, and we would do what we can at the city level, but I would see that task force being the leader of trying to actually get units built, particularly because we're dealing with the the lower income or affordable housing, which largely the private market isn't going to tap for us, is my guesstimate. So.
Great point. Sheriff Richard, do you have a comment?
I think Rob just covered most of that. So, in addition to, thanks for Councillor Blissett for raising that. And the other part is on just a purely numerical sense, they're, overt about mentioning that homeless counts aren't included. And so the numbers of those low income seniors, for example, aren't included. So that further, exemplifies what Rob just went over, that's the end that we need. So having that local expertise in a task force to look at those and connecting with the right partners to address that, critical. So thanks, Rob, you did excellent there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Councillor Teske? Nothing. Yeah, I certainly don't have much to add. Looking at the options, I certainly think that task force is probably the most expedient method, to move forward. It's about time, let's be honest, and probably at the end of the day, that's the best to compress the time. I guess going forward, is anybody aware of any funding sources that might be available that would support strategic development? CF Richard.
Council's already approved some money in the capital budget. When we were earlier looking at housing, we talked about, I think I labeled it something around housing authority or housing. So that, I think it's 50,000 is what we would intend to put to this. So rather than putting ourselves on one track of a housing body, is more taking the task force approach, looking more broadly, and then deciding on what's the best vehicles through the task force of actual delivery. And that would be a far better strategy now that we've kind of learned a lot from when we started at the original budget last fall till today. So the money's available. staff are prepared to move. We wanted to have this presentation so council could see the data. And then, we've already talked about the task force approach and how, I think you did a great job, Jada, there of talking about the different methods when you basically send a consultant away and then you get another report, you're all sitting around in a room looking at each other after the fact. Whereas if we've got a group of local champions that are really hand selected, that are specifically the ones to address the need areas in this community, you're going to get the best traction to move forward in whatever decisions need to be made. And so around the grant funding next is, I'm meeting with BC Housing tomorrow, and we're going to talk a bit about what they're going to come to council with on the 30th. And that's where we talk about worker housing funding and that sort of thing. There is things out there now. So the faster we can get on the ground and start moving on this, the better.
Thank you, and I agree. I at this point in time, certainly that housing authority funding that we approved would be better positioned right now, certainly at this strategy stage. So good stuff. Council, anything further? Councillor Graham.
Yeah, I guess just one more comment is like what we're looking at, even at the one person units of a total of 710 over 10 years. That's 70 units per year. I've sat around this council table for 8 years, and we've seen net eight, because those units weren't all just like for people to move in. So my question is, who is going to build 70 units a year? I think the government or these housing authorities are so tied up in Kelowna and Vancouver and Kamloops. Like, I think it's going to be a totally different strategy. Like the task force is great, but again, who's going to build them? Like, we need 70 units a year, and we can't. We got 8, and we got one a year. So that raises the flag, and it's like we're going to put all this time and effort in right now, and it's like I don't think we have a partner that's going to do that. If it is anything, it should be the private sector, with the way that the government could subsidize it. That's the only way it's ever going to get accomplished.
Rob, have you got a comment?
Yeah, I think just sort of being immersed in this topic recently and looking at going, down that path, clearly affordable housing is typically done through partnerships. I mean, I just came back from Rossland, and they just completed what would be an affordable workforce housing project in which they built housing above a city hall. So, but that was a combination of CBT, a housing provider, the city kicking in, and everything that we've been seeing lately. It's going to have to come from all levels of government, because funding is a big factor for most people, and certainly, but I think the task force and developing a strategy, I suspect, one of the top outcomes of a strategy would be, now this is the market we need to target. So how do we get to it? And looking at those best practices, looking at those examples, finding all the resources that might be available for the money. Because if there's money's there and the land is there, then someone will build it. It's just by a contract, right? That's typically how, someone will build it as long as there's money to be built, for it to be built. And so what we've been seeing a lot of, and I'll talk about in my presentation, or some of those other tactics, of course, it was mentioned in this presentation, the provision of land is an example that a municipality can do, or other sources of funding. And I mean, we're looking at, this housing need and some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in my presentation of what we're sort of envisioning from the OCP perspective to translate to zoning, and for example, and half as well. There's multiple facets under which we can try and get that. I think, will we ever hit it? Probably not. Nobody's hitting their targets. I don't think. But certainly it would be, it has to be all in, immersive. Like, this is kind of, in order to actually make a dent in this is like a full-time gig, you know what I mean? And really just getting your head buried into it, because there is funding there. But it's having the resources and the people to get it, and meeting the criteria and all those types of things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the conundrum, is who's actually going to build it. We can approve everything under the sun, but if the market isn't there, or the developers aren't there, or the funding isn't there, it's not going to happen. So I think the task force and the city being kind of the leader umbrella organization, I was joking, herding the cats. It's bringing everyone to the table. And we've had this discussion on a number of different topics, right? The homelessness, even in years past, it's how do we get the social sector together to actually come together. So it's just the methodology by which we would do it. And then, so once you have that strategy, I envision having that task force and those people, hitting that ground running, identifying those funding sources as they come and all those types of things to really try and get stuff done. It's not going to be an easy task. I don't want to sound like I'm pessimistic, but it's monumental when you look at these numbers. But this, talking to the planning team here, like, we're not an anomaly. This isn't something that's a Cranbrook-centric situation. It's just that how are we going to address it is what's the unique thing. And so sort of, with the direction of having, a task force as a starting point, that's sort of the all hands on deck kind of process at this point that I see. But that's my hardest, is how do you get things built? I always said that if someone could just give me a pot of money, I could call 6 developers and say, here you go, I'd get it built. Yeah. I can guarantee you I shouldn't guarantee. I have a pretty good probability that I could call any number of people I've worked with. If I said, here's 10, 15, $20 million, I need 40 units, it'd get done. Yeah. Right? But unfortunately, the funding models and things don't quite work that way.
Good. Thanks, Rob. Councillor Ray.
Thank you. Not Councillor Stetsky. Very good. I just wanted to mention, and maybe Rob, you might have some of this in your upcoming presentation, but I think the nonprofit sector is in a different place than it was maybe a few years ago. There's nonprofits in town who have been involved and continue to be involved in services to homeless folks, and their boards are identifying that as part of their strategic plans that they want to be involved in further services in the housing continuum. So I think we're in a different place than we were a few years ago with our nonprofit sector. And I think the task force is a great place to get some more traction on that, and is going to help build that momentum and move forward. But I do think it's key that, we're not looking at market housing. And I think it's going to be the nonprofit sector that can help drive this. And I know, great to hear the example from Rossland. There's a project in the works in Castlegar that's in development, and I believe they're working with a First Nations developer that specializes in these types of housing projects. So I think there's some resources out there and that'll be a great task for the task force to look at those kind of out of the box solutions that we probably haven't had an opportunity to look at before. So I think we're in a good place to have some new approaches, and it is a big task, but we need to start, and a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So we are going to start.
I agree with you. It is a big task. That's why we're going to put a task force forward and tackle it. Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Jada and Kevin. And do you have anything more to add?
Thank you, Mayor. Maybe one thing I'll mention is, as I was listening to various councillors and their comments, is that the framework of the strategy, being led by the task force, it can definitely be through the lens of looking at strategies that can have an immediate impact, those low-hanging fruit that you can actually see results, quite quickly, in parallel with also strategies that are playing a bit more of the long game. So you have that sustained, more sustained type of environment that you're creating that can enable planning and development in the long term. And one really good example that's been brought up here is establishing a housing authority. And this is something that we've been working on in a few different communities, just either high-level feasibility studies or best practices research, and it seems to hear a new authority being popped up in many communities on the island and Burnaby, all kinds of places. But authority is a really excellent vehicle for a local government to have more influence over the development of housing units that align with housing unit estimates. It's really getting a local government as one of the players instead of just being the referee of development. And so it is really good. However, I would say that based on the research that I've seen, that a housing authority is one of those strategies that is playing the long game, because it does usually take a number of years to establish an entity. You have to, the organizational structure, the legal components, the accounting, staffing it up, getting your funding structure in place, your operating model. It needs to have a work plan, securing sites, partnerships, all that kind of good stuff. When talking with Marla from the Whistler Housing Authority, for example, she's told me after, looking at 20 years, the first number of years was kind of a slow start, but really once you build a portfolio, you're able to leverage that portfolio to access more financing, and you're generating revenue to do more interesting mixed tenure projects. And at some point, you start actually attracting and being a magnet for investment because you're well established and you've demonstrated projects. But the early days, it was a bit slower, but accelerated, after 10, 12 years or so. So if we look at the strategy as a framework, and again, working with the task force, we might want to pursue a lens of those long-term strategies, and also the ones that can have a short-term to deal with more of those acute crises, so we can be in a position to secure funding and develop units quite quickly. But then other things like an authority is an example. I don't know if the task force would identify an authority as a strategy, but that would be something playing the long game, and communities benefit from having both on the table, those short and those long-term strategies. So sorry, a little bit of a tangent, but hopefully that provides a little bit of help too in thinking of the potential of where the task force could go.
Yeah, no, very much appreciated. I think very much in line with what we've been discussing, some of these issues for the past several months. So again, thank you very much, Jada and Kevin, and we'll be talking to you again probably in the next few weeks, next few months. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Moving on, so we're going to hear from staff on the draft official community plan and the Housing Accelerator Fund.
Okay, here I go. I'll do some more talking now. Just waiting for there we go, my presentation. So I guess when we had originally discussed this idea of having a committee of the whole, one of our initial thoughts was we might know about half, so it might go one direction. Well, we don't. So, however, I don't fret. I think what I want to talk about here is just sort of where we're at, just so you guys know. I mean, because this is such an emerging topic and we're all in it. I just wanted to show you kind of where we're at, where we're going with the OCP, talk a little bit about, half, what are we doing right now, despite everything, to look at housing, and then, kind of going forward in the future. And so just on. GD clicker box isn't working. Backup player. The antenna. Okay. So what I'm going to do just very briefly, obviously we'll just quickly touch on the housing needs report. What I wanted to share with you, because it's been brought up a few times and I mentioned it, is kind of the OCP. Just so you know, I wasn't lying. This is what it looks like right now. This is the OCP. But I'm going to highlight, obviously, one of the kind of new sections on housing and sort of the things that we've been putting in there to show you where we're going. A little bit of a discussion on how policy can influence bylaws, a little overview of the Housing Accelerator Fund and an update. What are we doing? And then where do we go? So again, just a quick recap. This table is enlightening. Yeah, it's a little bit frightening maybe at times if you look at it. But I think it gives us a good snapshot. There's no one way of doing this. Nothing's perfect, but this gives us a pretty good idea using the stats that we have available through this report, but also the anecdotal information that we've collected. And then, of course, we just learned last week, the snapshot on the homeless situation. So just add another 116 to that, and the seniors, and so the number kind of just keeps climbing, unfortunately. But this is where we're at, and I think this is a great first step above the report that we did, a few years ago, which was kind of mandated by the province before, housing was quote unquote a crisis, right? So it's really interesting. And one thing that we identified, in the original report was about a 400 unit mark. And you look at what's transpired since then. We've had the Innes Avenue project, which was 300 thereabouts, 297, I think, and our vacancy rate hasn't changed a lick. So we're still sitting at 0.9%. So that this type of information gives me confidence in knowing that, you know, what we're missing clearly. And of course, just everything we've been hearing from all the different groups and needs. So this was just, you know, again, a little refresher of what we had heard. As far as the OCP, this is sort of the next step from a planning perspective where I think we as a city and a community will identify, you know, housing and a number of other topics as a core issue that we should address. And it starts at the OCP level in my mind from a policy perspective. So, you know, in consideration of, you know, this council direction, previous council direction, public engagement, anticipation of the HAF grant, the housing needs update, current best practices, and legislative requirements. The draft OCP provides a guiding principle specifically related to housing. And this is what the guiding principle says. It's support the provision of affordable and attainable housing options for all residents. And so, you know, basically what we're talking about is trying to find ways to create housing. So it actually is a fundamental guiding principle of the OCP, in addition to a number of other principles that we'll see when it gets unrolled. But I just wanted to highlight this just so you know, because you haven't seen the OCP yet, that this is something that is top of mind, top of frame for the work that we are doing and working towards. The next few slides might seem a little overwhelming, but it's actually a representation of the actual section, the OCP policies on housing. And it's about 3 or 4 pages of all the policies, because I just wanted to show you that it's actually is top of mind. But some of the ones that come to my mind, you know, that are things that we're trying to look at from a policy perspective to work towards, you know, encouraging mix of housing types. That's what we're hearing every day now. It seems to be a big component of the Housing Accelerator grant. So of course, just having policy to encourage and support that. Amending zoning bylaw to permit alternative forms of infill housing on residential lots, including accessory dwelling units. You know, one thing I can comment on, our bylaw was drafted in 1996. It's ancient, it's out of date. If I had to say, it was built on a premise of the old way of thinking, perhaps from planning. Times have changed. And so, you know, like I said, I don't want to, you know, bash on the higher levels of government, but I find it ironic that, you know, the politicians are now telling us that density is the thing we should be doing when we've been trying to do it for decades, you know, as a planner. So it's interesting. Paradigm shift is what I'm calling it. It's really interesting in my world. And so, yeah, I mean, the next step, we'll get into this, but as you know, it's in the budget. You know, the zoning bylaw is the next step. So it's getting this OCP done and adopted, provides the policy framework for which then we can tackle from a regulatory standpoint. But you know, we have policies with to look at, you know, amending the zoning bylaw to reduce the minimum parcel size requirements for residential zones. You know, the idea of maybe a large lot house, white picket fence might not be the thing anymore if you want to address the housing needs. So, you know, our bylaw has lots of old standards for large parcel sizes. One thing that we want to look at, and we've discussed at the staff level, would be D here, is actually amending the bylaw to establish maximum parcel sizes for residential zones. So people can't go and create 1 acre lots, half-acre lots, if that's what we're direction, you know, and depending on where it is in the city, but it's giving us the direction to look at this. And the next couple, IJK, encourage new housing development to be multi-unit residential, because we're continuing to try and encourage some multi-unit. I mean, by no means are we trying to say that single family is out, but we know from a planning perspective, asset management perspective, tax-based perspective, that idea of just single family lots doesn't necessarily cut the cake anymore. Encourage multi-unit residential to include a variety of unit types, which is really interesting because we just heard that today, the unit breakdown and the need on that. So, you know, ensuring that when we talk about projects or development or zoning changes, we look at ways to try and encourage that mix of unit types to try and address the housing need. Continue to promote efficient use of infrastructure and land base by supporting infill. One of the things that I'm sure we've all heard coming down the pipe is the BC government is going to be preparing some legislation to almost say an as of right type zoning idea that you'll be able to have more than 1 unit on a lot. Yet to be seen. I don't know how that's going to roll out, but I know it's on their radar and it's going to be coming. And like I said, it's also a significant component to all the successful HAF applications that we've heard, that the federal minister is requiring that these municipalities basically adopt bylaws that allows for everything up to 4 plexes on lots. Interestingly, we've been talking about this before even HAF, so I think we're on the right track, right? It gives we're showing, at least I think we're showing to our community and to ourselves and to the municipality and even to the higher levels of government that this is something that's a priority for the city of Cranbrook. Also look at, policy to support solutions for providing affordable rental, owner-occupied housing from all the different levels. Again, the high-level policy, because that's what an OCP is. And then now we talked about, something like a task force, which is actually how you make this happen, right? So these policies lend well to support for the work that we're thinking of down the path we want to go. Let's go back one here. Again, M, support development for both market and non-market rental housing, establishing residential tenure zoning. Under the Local Government Act, we have provision to establish rental only zoning, something the city could consider to avoid or potentially discourage things like strata conversions, which I think took, historically might have taken a lot of our rental pool out in Cranbrook, as well as other communities, but here specifically, I lived as a personal experience, the place I lived in was strata converted. Fortunately, I ended up just buying it. Otherwise, I would have been out trying to find somewhere else to live because we have a policy that states that if we have a vacancy rate of 5% or more, council will consider strata conversions. Might be time to relook at that, and there's a policy to support relooking at strata conversion policy as well. And then just again, supportive policies to continue to enact policies and regulations to encourage, adequate supply of affordable housing, appropriately designed, located, serviced, etc. This next slide is just kind of, it's similar to a provision we have in the OCP now, but it's sort of a bit of a checklist. If people are coming in to apply to change the zoning and OCP is for a project, these are the things we want to see. What are you bringing to the table? We're trying to encourage intensification of land use, mixed densities, community amenity contributions, which is something new. It's basically a tool that that local governments have that can be negotiated at the time of development, where developers might provide some sort of amenity contribution. And so we haven't really done too many. I don't think we've done any, actually. The closest we would have had would have been the application we were dealing with in Wildstone a couple of years ago for the apartments, where the developer had suggested they would contribute, whatever number it was to building a sidewalk. That would be that's a community amenity contribution. So it's kind of over and above. But in order for it to be sound, the provincial government has said you should have, embedded in policy in an OCP. So part of this process was to establish that. And then, look at dedication of parks and open spaces, preservation of environmentally sensitive areas and on and on. So basically good planning practice is what we want to see when you're coming up with an application to change your zoning. And then the last couple that I wanted to touch on, consider implementing housing incentive programs. Heard that as a suggestion in the presentation earlier. There's financial incentives we could look at, the DCCs, some of which we'll talk about as part of half, density bonusing to encourage units, there are a number of different tools. So we're trying to establish the policy direction to allow us to pursue those. And then consideration of establishing a housing fund by, and a bylaw to collect amenity contributions. A lot of communities do that now. I can think of, examples in the Lower Mainland where, they might have a policy that says 5% of your total units must be contributed towards the housing, affordable housing. So, if you have 10 units, 5% of that get handed over or something like that, or cash in lieu, or any number of different ways you can do it. The caveat with some of these tools is that I think just through practice and experience is that you kind of have to have, obviously, the strong political will to say no is one of them. But two, you also have to be in a market where these types of incentives will, it entices the developer. I mean, historically in Cranbrook, we haven't had a market where you have, if developer A doesn't want to do it, developer B is chomping at the bit and he will, right? So if person A says, I don't want to do anything, no contributions, B is going to say, I'll do it. The larger markets, the more intense markets, they've been able to do that. But again, times can change, and those are tools. But I just wanted to say that, we are looking at establishing these types of things in policy. So it's embedded as a policy of the community that this is what we want to try and pursue. It doesn't happen overnight, but if it's here, it gives us that direction going forward. So that's kind of the gist of the housing section of the OCP. So just want to let you know, like we're trying to be on it. You know, we're doing our best. They are high level, but again, it's the high level policies that we use then to translate into bylaws, policies, actions going forward. So that kind of leads me into so how can OCP policy influence bylaws? So again, once an OCP is adopted, it provides staff with the guidance to take those policies and translate them into regulations. A little example I have in the bottom corner. For example, draft policy supports infill housing such as laneway or carriage homes. You know, when we're redoing the zoning bylaw, we'd look at proposed regulations to facilitate that in the city of Cranbrook. You know, it's been done before. It's not rocket science. We borrow lots of things from other municipalities. You look at those practices and tailor them to your community, see what works best. So, you know, as you probably already know this, but I mean, when we develop regulations, you know, it's based on best practices, example from other communities. We don't reinvent the wheel. Lots of these things have been done. They've been done well. And so it's just how finding them and then bringing them into the context of our own city to best fit Cranbrook. And then other future city policy can inform bylaw changes as well. And certainly, you know, I'm thinking forward, this task force, maybe there's something that would come out of the action strategy and, you know, an action plan that would make recommendations that the city should pursue from a policy and bylaw perspective that maybe we haven't thought about, or we should enhance, or, you know, so that's how I kind of see that unfolding in terms of how we can actually start to influence the regulatory component of what we do to try and see things happen. You know, in our department work plan, the zoning bylaw rewrite is expected to commence as the OCP nears the adoption phase, with the caveat that, you know, if we are successful with the Housing Accelerator Fund, some of the initiatives supported by these draft policies, we might expedite in order to meet the timelines to meet half. So it might be a bit of a hybrid approach. If we are successful, we might be undertaking the accessory dwelling unit program, which is part of our half application quicker, create something, adopt it in the existing bylaw, and then just translate it, transfer over to the bylaw going forward. So we're thinking about how we could make this happen depending on what happens with that. So it's very much on the top of our minds, but you know, it is in the work plan. The official community plan, we have a tentative schedule here that it'll be released to the public on the website second week of November. And we'll start the engagement process with a survey for feedback. We are going to be spending 2 days at the Christmas market with a booth to be there to represent the OCP. One of the main successful engagement sessions we did for this OCP was actually being at the farmers market. And the timing works out well because that Christmas market is probably one of the biggest attended events in all of Cranbrook where you have a captive audience. So we're going to set up a booth probably in the foyer. We've got the go ahead from the farmers market. So the consulting team's going to be up here, and I'll probably spend a few hours there over the course of the weekend just to kind of promote the OCP questionnaires, et cetera. So really get it out there so we can keep the ball rolling, get it to the point where we can have a final draft and start entering into the actual formal approval phase, which is slated to kind of occur early in the new year, where we actually start bringing bylaw for adoption to council. Again, just the Housing Accelerator Fund. So here's a quick snapshot of what we had proposed in our application. Land acquisition, disposition strategy, and infrastructure readiness, the city land component, infill strategy, providing opportunities for developing missing middle, accessory dwelling unit implementation strategy, delegated authority process updates, development cost charge fee update, and incentive affordable rental housing, the downtown redevelopment strategy, and the secondary suite legalization and new suite conversion incentive program. So as you can see, a lot of our accelerator fund initiatives in anticipation of the HAF application, we're trying to capture, and not just because of HAF, but also good practice trying to capture in the policy I just showed you the direction we're going. So if this is successful, then some of that stuff might be expedited. And in recent days, like literally 2 days ago, the CMHC and the minister kind of put out a little bit of a bulletin and said, here's the top 10 things that municipalities are doing in their applications. These 7 are in there essentially. So that's good from my perspective. Whether or not it's enough to give us be successful for the grant is another thing, but it makes me comfortable in that I think we hit the mark that we were kind of anticipating what they were looking for. And we're going to try and reach out to somebody if we can actually get a hold of a human being to see, because what they did is suggest that, you might want to revisit your application. And so we'll try and reach out just to see, hey, like we saw your list 2 days ago, we got in line. Should we change anything? Should we? But basically the application is through a portal and we check it every day. We check every day to see the status of that, to see what it says. And it just says in process. And we scan the news every day to see what's happening, who's getting the grants, so we're really trying to keep a pulse on what's happening. So just the recap on half. And so, we were committed to the unit requirement. We're somewhere in the neighborhood, a couple hundred units would be facilitated through half or more, a bit of a drop in the bucket compared to 1,400, but it's still something more than we're doing now. So, I mean, everything that we can do going forward, it will hopefully benefit the city, but it is a big task when you see those numbers and you're thinking, and you're hearing, the grants for the big cities. Oh, they're committing to 2,000 units. They're committing. I mean, the scale of that compared to us you can't even compare yet. We're in the same category for consideration. And just to highlight, many anticipated initiatives of half are supported by the draft housing policies. And then, expediting a lot of those initiatives should we be successful. And that'll somewhat change the work plan for the department going forward for the next 3 years, essentially. And then, what are we doing now? So, of course, adopt supporting policies and bylaws. I think a big step, obviously, is the OCP. I hopefully what you're seeing today is kind of hitting the mark. If not, let us know, because we're still in draft form. Things can be changed. And then, of course, I think based on the presentation today and my own kind of philosophy on how these things could unfold, but I think really having a strategy or action plan to develop those priorities based on the needs assessment, and then identifying those tools to achieve those actions, and having an implementation strategy really, to me, would be the next step. Whether it's through a task force or any other methodology, but because I just think that if you don't have that, then we kind of can just flail in the wind, and we'll try this and we'll try that, and then we end up doing things piecemeal, or So trying to take a bit more of a strategic, targeted approach, and it seems to be the best practice. Obviously, is having a strategy and an action plan that then gets followed through with. So, and it sounds like we're kind of heading that direction again, so that's great. But this is sort of what we're doing now. So between the OCP, the Housing Accelerator Grant, and what we're envisioning for the OCP, I think we're on our way. What else can the cities do? So this is a little snapshot of from the document that I sent you via email with the leading best practices. So that was part of an advisory group in 2017, and Councillor Popoff will remember he was attended the workshop where I was invited as a participant on the advisory group that was led by the Center for Sustainability for Whistler on this leading practices for smaller communities. Part of being a member of that advisory group was establishing a bit of a housing workshop back then. So I guess we could say maybe at the time we were being innovative. It just wasn't as important, say, or maybe not as critical at that time. But one of the things that came out of that, which was touched on a little bit by Jada and something that I mentioned, just to show you what cities can do. I mean, our hands are tied obviously by the Local Government Act and Community Charter, but there are things that we can do: inclusionary zoning, density bonusing, intensification and tenure through zoning, reducing costs, all these types of things. Again, they're best practices. We're not reinventing the wheel. Some of the things we have done or we'd like to do, some we don't, but maybe we could consider, right, depending upon the outcomes of the strategy. But partnering for land and financing is options municipalities can do, and then capacity building, housing organizations, growing capacity, having a strategy, communication and education. So I just wanted to give you those two documents as well in your email that just sort of showed the stuff's been out there for a little while. Not much has changed in the world, but there are other tools. But that was kind of a neat exercise when I go back. I'm like, that was 5 years ago now. So, and here we are again. It's coming right back full circle. So, we're starting to make those steps. And then just from a next steps perspective, the draft OCP out for public review in November, targeting February for bringing it to the table for consideration for readings. Waiting for half. Again, depending on the outcome of that, the workflow might change a little bit, might potentially postpone adoption of the OCP because we will, for example, the downtown redevelopment strategy, we would really look at just integrating the downtown plan in its entirety into the OCP just to get it done, right? It was part of the plan we'd like to do. It's one of our initiatives. We'll have to do that. So the OCP might be a little bit longer, but then that's done and it's been supported through the Housing Accelerator Fund. Beginning the zoning rewrite in early 2024. And then, of course, noted the mayor's housing task force because that was announced last week. So, and with that, that's kind of my housing 101 where we're at.
Great stuff, Rob. You know, when I look at all this, and again, the amount of work that's gone into all of these components that we're bringing forward now by staff, you know, I don't know how you had time to do your regular job. I really don't, you know. So thank you very much, you guys. And everybody here gets that. There's no question about it. And, you know, these aren't something you just threw together to bring to us. You guys have put a lot of work in it. It's been done very professionally. And yeah, you know, on the Housing Accelerator, you know, I'd be quite disappointed if we weren't considered. You know, we dropped everything, and you know, and you know, the excitement and the energy and the work that went into it, you know. And like you say, now when you really start looking at the numbers and they're throwing stuff out, here's what Vancouver was asked was, here's what Kelowna's ask was, and well, here's ours. But right, yeah. And I think the other side, real quick, I'll go around the table, is I'm looking, you know, and you know, these 900 affordable houses that we need, you know, I get it, but sooner, and you know, this council certainly has been trying to work with the province and let them know that, you know, we take a different position than the last council. We're fully supportive. We want to work with them. We support their policies. But BC Housing, that model is so broken. And BC Housing is so frustrating because if we're going to rely on BC Housing, we see it, you know, again, look at our targets, look at these other guys. And, you know, I mean, I don't even know how BC Housing gets out of the Okanagan, to be honest with you. But, you know, the Premier's been pretty insistent on our responsibilities. And you know what? Those 900 are on us. We don't have the ability to do it on our own. We need that. And you know, I'll work with Council and Mark going forward. And try and work with the province, but sooner or later, somebody's got to put it out there and say, listen, here's the Premier's expectation. Do you know what? That's not a reasonable expectation for community Cranbrook size. And you know, it's not just a community our size. It's tax-based too, because I don't like this size comparison in communities, because we're the same size as Fort St. John, you know, a little smaller in particular. Well, Fort St. John gets $24 million a year from the Peace River Agreement. Like, you know, 24, everybody in this room knows what 24 million bucks a year means. I don't know what Penticton, you know, they've got other revenues. They get casino revenues, things like that we just don't even see, right? So, you know, there's other elements in just size comparisons that, you know, I think that Cranbrook really has to be considered, but that's kind of my little rant there. And it's really frustrating for me. No, the amount of work that goes into this, you know, we're so sincere and dedicated to move on this stuff. And if we're not even getting a glance, that's really frustrating. And I get, you know, it's all about how you vote sometimes, but, you know, but it is frustrating for me. Anyways, we'll go around the table. Councillor Stetsky.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Rob. Absolutely agree with what you've put into the OCP and really appreciated getting a copy of that 2017. Lots of great ideas in there. Two quick questions. One is I've been wondering about for a while. When a developer comes to council for increasing density and zoning and it's approved, are you aware of any communities that time limit that approval as sort of an incentive to get them to do something? In other words, if they do not actually develop that piece of land after 3 years, it reverts back to its original zoning and they have to start all over again.
Sure. So through the mayor to Councillor Setsky, the Local Government Act under the zoning provision to establish and adopt bylaws doesn't actually give us the power to do that. And I did, we do actually have a legal opinion on that. I had to go back. I did find it. It was earlier, we brought that question forward. And so we don't actually have that tool. And I think largely because bylaws have to go through the legal process. And once a bylaw is adopted, naturally the only way to change it is again by bylaw. So with respect to zoning. And so I guess the conundrum that I would see with that is at the end of the day, you know, what we're really looking at is whether or not the particular use is appropriate for that site, not necessarily who the developer is, who the builder is, or what the project is that's part of the consideration for sure. But at the end of the day, is that parcel suitable for multifamily? And so, you know, if we go through the motions and approve a project and it doesn't come to fruition, I mean, certainly council has the ability to go and I guess we call it down zoning. You would initiate a bylaw amendment to go and take that zoning back to what it was. I think the problem with that is it's really hard to get up zoning. And so once you have it, I would be reluctant to want to get rid of it. I think the key would be is just hopefully you'd have someone else who can come in to do the development. The problem is that, as we talked about earlier, you know, that Councillor Graham has brought up is you can't compel developers to do anything at the end of the day because their business is based on numbers and pro formas and all these other external factors which we can't control. And I think to penalize a landowner because they can't move forward by downzoning their property would probably be a little bit problematic per se. I would almost certainly venture to guess we'd end up in court just because of that notion. But the tools just don't exist under legislation to automatically do that. It would have to be through a bylaw process.
Thank you. Just a bit of information. I represent council on the Seniors in Partnership Group, which is a collection of all of the different agencies working on behalf of seniors. And I did bring up the topic of the campground and the possibility, and I don't know if this is something we'll deal with later on, of it becoming low-income seniors housing. A great deal of excitement around the table, and I think if we ended up going that route, and of course there's a lot of discussion to happen before we get to that, I think that would put to rest a lot of the criticism about losing the campground. I mean, how can you argue against helping low-income seniors?
No, absolutely. And I think, I mean, at this point, obviously, there's been no direction given specifically for the campground. But as we saw today, one of the top tools that a municipality can do is provision of land for housing, because that is one of the big limiting factors that we encounter fairly regularly by phone calls. And I mean, I like almost weekly with particularly lately the different levels of housing provider, be it First Nation governments or other organizations, is finding a piece of land to do it on. And so that certainly is something that can be considered through the Housing Accelerator as part of that initiative, or going or in the future. But that's something that would be up to council, and then of course, you know, everything that follows with that. But that's one of the top tools that we've seen that's a best practice, is the provision of land for housing in order to try and make to bridge that gap. So certainly trying to utilize what we have.
Councillor Bassett.
Thank you. One of the things in my daily travels through an old part of Cranbrook, we certainly have large empty lots. And there's actually a large lot for sale right now on the bottom of Fifth Ave that can be developed. So I'm not sure about public land for development. I do think there's a lot of private land that is available throughout downtown Cranbrook to develop. And I had one of the councillors at Regional District mentioned that in another location, and I don't remember where, that the city had put together sort of fourplex plans to make available, to encourage individuals to do that. Because there certainly is a lot of space on private land throughout downtown Cranbrook. And if I don't know, maybe that would be part of the task force. I'm not sure that we need a whole seniors housing development, but if you had 5 fourplexes put in, that's something. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I've seen lately, there's been a couple of municipalities that have gone so far as to have like kind of quote unquote pre-approved designs for like accessory dwelling units. Quesnel was one example. That is actually one of our half initiatives, in that we don't have funding dedicated through our budget process at this time. I mean, certainly could be something that if we're not successful, that if we wanted to do that, but that certainly was one of the initiatives that we looked at to try and expedite the process of building those types of units where, you know, if you have pre-approved designs, a person come in for their permit, they just make sure you meet the setbacks. You know, it's good from a building code perspective, you know, it's good from you know, all the other requirements, and then it can kind of help speed up the process for that. Certainly the notion of infill housing, looking at again, it's at the provincial level they're talking about it, it's at the federal level they're talking about it, and you know, at the local level we're talking about it as well, is looking at, you know, trying to maximize potential, I'm calling it gentle density. So you're integrating, you know, a couple of units on a lot, for example. I mean, even small garden apartments, if you look at Cranbrook historically, which this was an interesting fact, and I don't want to digress too far, but I look back at the zoning bylaws from the 70s, and the original R1 zoning allowed for up to fourplexes on R1 zoning. And that's why you have duplexes and fourplexes strewn out throughout the city that were built in that era. We allowed for that. Times changed and things evolved, and planning thoughts and principles and things that evolved, and you know, that we took that out, and now we're talking about going back to it. Yeah. So, you know, and because we have little garden apartments in the city, and so that's one of the things that we're looking at, because I know, you know, like our R2 zoning, for example, a good chunk of downtown, the upper downtown, Baker Hill, you know, is zoned R2, but you know, it allows for 1, 2, 3, or 4. But then it says you have to have 302 square meters of land area per dwelling unit. So now you have to have almost a quarter acre, half acre for a fourplex in order to meet the zoning bylaw. So what we did, we being collectively the city, and you know, decades ago, was kind of establish these criteria where virtually no parcels owned in Baker Hill can actually do more than a single family residence, because they don't have enough land area based on that regulation, which is why the policy we're supporting looking at changing those. So absolutely, those are the types of things that we can do with or without half. We're trying to support it from an OCP perspective, and it's certainly top of mind as to how we can look at providing those options for people for infill, because somebody might want to tackle a fourplex or a duplex for themselves. We don't need big developers. I mean, necessarily, not that we don't need them, but those are the types of developments that those folks won't do. But someone might go, hey, I might build a duplex. I can get mine and I'll rent out the other one. The province is going to be, they announced that they're doing a secondary suite forgivable loan program in the spring. It's tied to restricting rent, but you know, if they have, I think it was $40,000, you know, a person might be able to apply for that. We have the secondary suite legalization grant as part of our half. You know, that might make it more enticing for someone to develop a suite, and it's capped at a rent, which the province is requiring. Again, it provides another unit in that income range of everything. So we're really trying to find ways that we can try and tackle all the categories. And certainly infill is one of our, you know, certainly seems to be a big bang for buck.
And we have a great supply, and it would also make our community far more vibrant too. So I think it's just a win-win in all ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if it's done well and done right, we've seen examples. I think I can think of the most recent duplex that was approved by council and is under construction now on 13th. It's a duplex with secondary suites. That's 4 units right there, right? And so, but it fits within the neighborhood. It's, you know, so it can be done. It can be done well. And certainly there's different ways of doing that, pre-approved designs, flexible zoning regulations, all kinds of things that we can look at to try and encourage that. So we can try and address that continuum, because one secondary suite is an additional unit, right? And it's an additional bedroom or 2 bedrooms, and that helps that target. So.
Right on. CEO first, you had a comment?
Just further to that. So thank you for that. And just, you know, it's something that Councillor Stetsky brings up often too. So when we have vacant land in the inside of the city, what Rob's just talked about is all of the incentivizing tools, or the carrots, so to speak. What we're missing is the stick. And so a lot of these pieces of vacant land, because they are vacant, they attract very low taxation. There's no incentive for the owners to sell them. So we could deny all the peripheral development to the end of time, and they'll still sit on those lots with too high up prices and no incentive to sell. So in an advocacy role, creating a stick, now that we have some representation on UBCM, is maybe the province could look at providing some kind of differential zoning rates that we could apply. If we've identified a zone that we'd like to see development where there's vacant land, it would attract a higher level of taxation in order to disincentivize sitting on it forever and drive some of that. Because right now, bare land is very low tax. You can sit on it to the end of time with no development and you don't care. So if we're going to incentivize, I just wonder if there's something that this council may want to push through to next year's UBCM around disincentivizing sitting on vacant land within the core area that we'd like to see developed.
Point, very good point. Councillor Ray.
Thank you, Mayor. I was just curious, Rob, you know, thinking about, like, I remember when Kootenai Street Village was being built through Golden Life, there was a hope in the community, I think, that, you know, those seniors would move into Kootenai Street Village and then their homes would be available for sale and new folks would go into those homes. And, you know, similar around College of the Rockies student housing. Okay, the college has built this housing and this is going to kind of help with some of this. And now we have the short-term rental legislation coming down from the province, and probably that won't have such a big impact on Cranbrook as it might in other communities where I think short-term rentals are probably more of a reality. But I'm just curious, you know, what your sense is on that. Did we overestimate the impact like a Kootenai Street Village would have? Do we have a sense that that helped in any way?
So a bit of yes and no. I think like anything, we kind of, that example, you know, was a great project. I think, you know, that developer knows their market.
Mhm.
They know the need. They're building to that market. They secured some funding. So some of those beds are for the province.
Mhm.
I think we're still seeing demographic change in Cranbrook anecdotally where, you know, no offense, but the boomers, you know, they're still young enough that they want to live in homes.
Mhm.
So that's some of the market that we're driving. So, but I certainly think that we're lacking in senior housing. Obviously, it's clear that housing or the homelessness stat that we heard that, you know, whatever the percentage was of the people in the shelter are actually seniors. We've really only had one affordable seniors housing project that I can think of that was dedicated to Baker Gardens, and that was done 2010s. You know, or even for example, the market rent again, the Seymour Pacific Innis Avenue. I mean, we thought, man, we haven't seen purpose-built rental in 30 years, and they're going to come in at, you know, 297 units, and it's full. There's a wait list, and our vacancy rate hasn't changed. I think to see those types of impacts, it's a long term. It was where you would really see that, and I think we just simply need more of everything to some degree. The stat on the seniors particularly kind of hit me a little bit, you know, hard like last week, thinking like, really, like we have like, in our town where we have housing, like the seniors are in the shelter. And I mean, that's not, again, it's not unique to Cranbrook, but man, like that just seems so clearly there's a shortage of housing, affordable housing for that demographic. And so, you know, those types of private developments, they certainly serve a segment of the market. Absolutely. But again, now we have a better indication of the target that we're trying to achieve. Because yeah, Kootenai Street Village is full, you know, Joseph Creek full. Whether they have plans for more, I'm not sure. There's certainly been on the topic over the years. I've spoken to the developers and landowners who are looking at creating more senior housing. I suspect we'll see more of it over time as our demographics change in Cranbrook. But yeah, the downsizing notion is a tough one. I don't know if that's actually a true metric to actually see that happening. And certainly nowadays with the way, you know, interest rates, costs, I think people are going to stay in their homes a lot longer simply because unless you can, you know, sell and you have a nice nest egg and you can go to a private facility, which may, you know, be upwards of thousands of dollars a month. You know, I mean, I read an article that people are actually living on cruise ships now because it's cheaper than moving into a seniors facility. I kind of was like, that's kind of a cool idea, right? But that's where we're at in some cases. So yeah, I think to some degree we kind of overestimated thinking it would make a dent. It certainly shows that the need was there. That's the beautiful thing, that we didn't miss that mark. You know, we didn't have a project or projects that have been built that are sitting empty or only half built because there was no segment. I actually think we're still way under. Yeah.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up, slightly different sort of aspect. You know, Mayor Wilkes has talked a couple times at the RDEK about their recent project in Sparwood. And I'm not sure if the district of Sparwood, I think it was a long-term lease I don't think they do it as
I think
long-term lease.
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, and then a nonprofit partner and built, I don't know, 46 units or something. And he said they're talking about building a second, a second project with the same kind of numbers. So, yeah, I just look forward to for the task force moving forward. As I think we talked about earlier, sort of two parallel streams. One, shorter term, what can we do now? And then maybe things like housing authority and stuff longer term. But I think that example from Sparwood, like, yeah, Mayor Wilkes has said, I think initially he said 13 months, but more recently, I think he said 16 months. But still, a project from start to it is built within 16 months. I'd love to do that.
It's very much doable. Like I said, it's being done. You know, and there's different models. You know, I have visions of, you know, we talked about, I don't want to put words and I don't want, I guess for live, we gotta be careful. Like 8th Avenue, for example, right? Where it's like, you know, and if I had, you know, all the money in the world, or you'd be like, look what Roslyn just did. We used to say you don't have a development site where like, well, City Hall certainly needs more space. You can add more community, you know, ground floor commercial, and you throw 4 stories of housing above something like that. Now you're meeting again those new methods or models of housing provision where we become a partner. But I think, you know, having the right people on the task force who know where to get those monies and how to set up those partnerships and those requirements is what I would think we would want to be chasing as a task force member, because it is being done. It's just we don't have all the ins and outs and knowledge of that in-house. And we have various groups all doing it, but not together, right? And so if you bring those folks together, then yeah, and when there's a will, there's a way. Like you said, you know, 18 months. I know that the Roslyn project took 3 years start to finish, but it was a bit of a brownfield site. It was, you know, but they were successful. They had FCM funding, they got BC housing funding, they got CBT funding, they, you know, the city, it was city-owned land, like, you know, so those models are there, and it's just finding the ones that might work to get something off the ground. You know, we met with BC Housing, talking to them, Baker Gardens. I mean, that's one example, again, from a staff perspective only. I'm not putting any, there's a big piece of vacant land in between the 2 sets of units.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one where with the city, you know, we could say, hey, like, perhaps we just add more. You know, does BC Housing want to do it? Does the seniors group want to take on a project? Does, you know, what is it? And who should we be building to? So it's trying to find those opportunities. And now that this is sort of, I guess, a priority of the city with that task force, that's where those priorities will be identified. And then you start chasing the projects.
Thanks, Rob. And I think you guys have got another meeting. You got to be out of here very shortly. Councillor Popoff.
So you're putting the clock on me? Is that what you're doing?
Well, no, I'm just saying that it's their time.
Yeah,
exactly.
okay, so let me just summarize. Again, Rob hasn't been this excited in the last 9 years. Look at the excitement level with him and our staff. Very good. So good on you, and thank you for the report. When you listen to the news, what you're catching with the half and the federal incentives and the provincial expectations, where we're at right now, we are very much aligned with what the province and the federal government are expecting of us and how they're even going to incentivize us to then further go forward. We haven't done nothing in the last 9 years. Well, we're at the state where we have our file. We're going to be doing our OCP and zoning, which talks about some of these pieces, Councillor Brissett, you're identifying with the infill. We've got an asset infrastructure identification of where we are and where we need to go for pieces like 8th Avenue, for example, or the Baker property. We know we've done an assessment of our city-owned lands, and there might be more work we want to do on that. And now the housing task force. So I think we're in a great position that aligns with where we are with the federal and provincial expectations and funding. We just have to go forward. So congratulations, and I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Popoff. Councillor Graham.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of things, and just the things that I think about is if we're not successful with the half grant and we're still working towards some of these goals, like the big red flag is our infrastructure. Like when we look, like we shut down Victoria because of costs, but we know we need to do Victoria if we're going to continue with densification. Downtown core doesn't have the capacity to support hardly anything, and we know So how are we going to, where are we going to get the money to put in the infrastructure to feed the density over the next 10 years? If we start adding to this, these projects are, were big red flags. They will stop development. Where do they sit in this continuum of housing when we have these massive $70 to $90 million infrastructure projects to meet the demand? So it's great we can get the housing, but how are we going to get the infrastructure there?
Through the mayor to Councillor Graham, that is one of the items, and I believe it went through one of the draft UBCM resolutions, is really talking to higher levels of government, and that's where we really need, council's role as advocates to say, look at all the great work that the city of Cranbrook is doing. It's not our policies, it's not our planning, it's not our land use, it's not all these other things that they're pushing for. It is, in fact, the infrastructure deficits are some of the issues that are holding up our ability to do the housing. And that is something that has not been, there's a lot of money coming towards for housing. And we've seen other municipalities that have commented through the half grant as saying, we feel like we're proactive. We laid all this groundwork. We do need to just have some support for, I guess, for lack of a better word, bare bones infrastructure to support it. And we can show where it's a targeted need and where it's a specific need. And where, if we were to advocate for infrastructure funding, we can tie it to building affordable housing or have some of those items in place. So that is the hope, that there's that big advocacy role. But in the meantime, what staff's going to be doing, and this is sort of similar to the two-phase approach to what we're going to do with housing, is we're doing some more detailed infrastructure modeling to better identify where we do have capacity. We're going to be overlaying where we do have capacity with where we do have availability for densification. And that's what we really need to do, is to show those items. So we're doing a little bit more of those in-depth, the broader modeling perspective that we do when we're looking at this infrastructure needs is a big picture. It does use some larger assumptions. We've talked about the water use perspective, and the water use is reciprocal to the sewer usage. If we did have a reduction in water and sewer use, we would build capacity for building more houses tomorrow. So that is one of those approaches that would need to be taken. We do have inflow and infiltration. We do have some water leaks. So that's the city also making sure that we are proactively investing in our infrastructure. That's going to be coming forward from a budget perspective for budget considerations, is making sure we're continuing to meet our investment needs for water and sewer replacements and proactive maintenance, so we can build capacity within the existing framework. Some of the infrastructure upgrades that we have been doing in proximity to downtown on the South Hill, we started that about 7 or 8 years ago, is upsizing some of that infrastructure, knowing that some of this densification is going to occur. So rather than requiring an upgraded water main, if we're going to see a block of houses turn into a block of duplexes, we've done some of that proactive investment. So we do need to drill down. It is going to be a multi-pronged solution, from advocacy for some of these big projects. But in the meantime, we're looking at some of those more targeted areas, and we met with our engineering consultant this morning to really talk about how that big picture of the infrastructure planning is overlaying with these housing needs and the land use planning. And it's not all doom and gloom from that perspective. So we're hoping, in the coming months to be able to provide some more certainty to a lot of this infill and densification, to say, yes, a lot of that can be, we can green light, and then looking at some of those specific underdeveloped or undeveloped parcels that are either privately held or that we hold. And if we can start to say, look, maybe with some smaller upgrades, we can green light the ability for those to go, then we can start having discussions about those properties. So it's something that we're working on actively. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing is something that I'm wanting to as well proactively work on. Yeah, similar to what CAO First Coast talking about, is many, if not all, communities have large brownfield sites or have brownfield sites in their core. And I think that the two options are, again, work with the province to try and penalize these landowners that'll sit on it for 100 years, or B, just give the municipalities or the whatever the one-time means to do the cleanup. Because there's huge tracts of land that can be densified right there with that. And I can think of multiple spots that we have in Cranbrook that are tied up because of environmental. So I think there's ways that we can deal with brownfield, and that's definitely something throughout the province, that there are large brownfield sites in cores that would help with land availability.
Thank you. Further? Nothing further? With that, we're at the end of today's meeting. Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting? Councillor Bassett, seconder, Councillor Ray, all in favor? Adjourn. Thank you very much, guys.